Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
This week, we are excited to be joined by one of my favorite people all around, David FitzSimmons. David and I go way back to Emmer 2010 and have worked together on and off for over the years. He currently serves as Congressman Finstad's chief of staff. He first headed to Washington, D.C. with Congressman Emmer in 2015 and has since led the offices of Congressman Hagedorn and Congresswoman Fishbach as well. David is a former state representative himself and one of the most brilliant political minds ever, managing numerous campaigns over the years. With David, we are going to start by breaking down the recent move by President Trump to bring D.C. police under federal control. We'll talk about the reasoning behind this and David's thought as a Minnesota living part-time in Washington for more than a decade. Next, we are going to get a pulse on the overall political landscape here in Minnesota and nationally as we head towards the 2026 elections. Then, one of my favorite nerd conversations, we're going to get into recent polling of Minnesota priorities and opinions put out by America's First Policy Institute, which just launched a Minnesota chapter. This Minnesota arm is led by Ryan Wilson, who is a former state auditor candidate, and Zach Freimark, a former Emmer staffer and political operative, who I also go way back. We will be discussing more of this group and their goals for Minnesota soon. Lastly, we will get into some recent news about Minneapolis City Council aides participating in protests surrounding the June 3rd drug raid in Minneapolis. Thank you for joining us today and enjoy the show. We are back today with one of my favorite people and favorite guests, David FitzSimmons. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Becky. Always good to be on your show.
I always want to have to remind David that, David, I'm here too, okay?
Oh, yes.
So
and
thank you for being here too, David.
Yes.
That's right. Exactly. Wonderful. Just keeping me honest and right in my place right at the beginning.
Well, I appreciate you both being here with me today. So we're going to kick things off with the big news of the week. On Monday, President Donald Trump announced that him and his administration are taking over the Washington, D.C. Police Department. And they're putting it under federal control, activating 800 members of the National Guard in moves to reduce crime in our nation's capital. So this is something that is allowed. They have up to 30 days to take control of the city's police force. Officials have said that so far, 800 National Guard members and roughly 500 federal law enforcement agents are being deployed to the city streets to help curb crime. David, you've been living, part of the year in Washington, D.C., back and forth, for the last 10 plus years. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on, obviously, this move, but the crime in the area. Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? What are you and folks like you feeling walking down the streets during the day, during the evening? And is this move warranted?
Well, definitely. I think one of the things is, when people try to make a lot of equating actions that are taken in the District of Columbia with anything general across the rest of the United States is not really apples to apples. The District of Columbia is exactly that. It's a district. It's not a state. It's it really kind of a special, unique jurisdiction in the United States. Was set up as just the capital city, and certainly as it grew in population, there's been changes that have been made, but it's our seat of government. It's all of our elected officials, at the federal level, in one place, and so the security and the taking care of things is a whole different level that the presidential administration and Congress have for that, and I don't think any of us need reminding of a lot of the dangers that are out there. Certainly, we saw in Minnesota with the tragic, insane attack on Speaker Emerita Hortman and on Senator Hoffman and their families. So there's always a very different level of security and law enforcement action going on in Washington, D.C. than you would see most places. That said, it's suffered from a lot of elevated long-term, crime problems. And now all of that goes, up and down each year, both in comparison to itself and other cities and states. But it's certainly a persistent problem. And people see it firsthand. I mean, we have, right in our Minnesota orbit, Representative Craig was herself assaulted and attacked in Washington. We had a staff member on Congressman Finstad's uh, staff that was attacked and mugged and assaulted on the street. Um, and there's been many other, and obviously some of the high profile cases that precipitated maybe some of the most recent reactions. So it's certainly not unknown, and you definitely have to, pay attention a lot and make sure you're watching where you are and what's going on around you. And it's not always really apparent. I think, a lot of times we would equate, maybe run down or very, someplace that really looked, poverty stricken or dicey or some other thing that we think we would know that we're in a bad spot or a dangerous area. And that's just not always the case in DC. I mean, you'll be right next to very immaculate, stone buildings that you would think, oh, everything's great here. And then you see some things very quickly that you realize there's different drug activity or other things going on. And so, yeah, you do really have to pay attention. I've always made a point of trying to remember that I have to be on my guard and try to remind people to be cautious of that. So I think it's a real problem. I also find it interesting that a lot of the pushback is, well, it's not that bad. It's not, we're not record breaking. It's gotten a little better. I mean, to me, crime is one of those things where your goal should always be zero. Your result is never going to be zero. But it's hard to just say, well, I think we've got it good enough. And there's not that many murders right now. And there's not that many carjackings and assaults and rapes. And, I think we should always be striving for less of all those categories.
David, one of the points you brought up that I want to just ask about is we're all to varying degrees Republicans right now. Me, I'm considered somewhat of a homeless Republican. States' rights, federalism, those types of issues. One of the things I think it's important for people to understand is you made a really good point at the beginning. D.C. is different. This isn't like President Trump is coming into, while he's discussed it, it's not like he's taking over a city randomly across the country. There are specific things related to DC that it's a district, it's legally organized different. And that was just a point I wanted to go back to. Whereas, people can have a lot of these philosophical conversations, again, about states' rights, federalism, other things. But DC is different in terms of, correct me if I'm wrong, any other geographic space largely within the borders of the United States and in our 50 states. It's the only district, and the president has unique authority in that role, correct? And Congress.
Like you said, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia is an entity that there is no other equivalent in the United States. No other state, no other commonwealth, no other territory is organized like Washington, D.C. is. And that's been right from its founding. And so it does have different dynamics and quite frankly, different rules than any place else.
One of you made the point of, obviously always striving for zero when it comes to crime. And we see a little bit of this with the pushback, right? That, well, crime is down in 2024, and crime is down 35%. And, according to, there was only 187 homicides in 2024 in Washington, D.C. 87 homicides is still a lot of homicides. And this is our nation's capital. This is supposed to be the light shining beacon on the hill. And where, law and justice are bred and cultivated. And so it is something that, obviously there is a reason that it is allowed for the president to do so. We see some pushback. And David, I want your take on this. Because we understand that a lot of criticism of Trump and his administration in general they're just doing it for TV. They're just doing it for the fanfare and the support and the clicks or whatever it might be, rather than actually doing it for policy changes. And that's what we're seeing here is some people are, even Mayor Bowser came out saying, they're just doing this for TV. Don't go out and have, make sure your kids aren't out protesting in the streets, aren't in any large thing. They're looking for those TV moments. What's your take on that, versus it truly being a step in his tough on crime agenda?
Yeah, I mean, look, everything's political these days, right? And so oftentimes on both sides, things are being done for some political angle as well. I keep the attention on what you want, take it away from what you don't. And just like the reaction to it. I mean, I think there's so many people right now, obviously Democrats, sometimes others, that if Trump does it, they're going to be against it. It's pretty as simple as that. I mean, I've seen things that, I've seen people, be in favor of or opposed to, and Trump goes on the other side, and suddenly they seem to be on the opposite side of wherever, Donald Trump is. I mean, he's a very, unique figure in our history, and he seems to engender a lot of emotional reaction by people across the spectrum. So, I think there's people that are just they're going to be against whatever he's doing because it's him.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but how the policy is written is that the president can basically have control of this for 30 days unless there is congressional action or congressional approval. Do you think that's something that the Congress would seek to do to make it more long-term or permanent, perhaps?
As far as I know, there's been no official requests by the administration. That hasn't been something I've seen, brought up to the members or that we've been alerted about to look towards action on it. So, it's certainly possible. Congress is out of session right now. It's their longest out of session of the Congress. The traditional August recess, they're not there right now, so it's possible that it could come up, although with the timing, it would be presumably right after they get back into session after Labor Day.
I had one kind of comment / question / observation for either of you, and I appreciate your perspective on this. One of the things I think that's interesting is first of all, is something that we talked about a bit with Andy Brem on a previous episode, Becky. He was talking a bit and he was quoting he had written an op-ed for the Star Tribune about the rise of the DSA and in some of these cities. And he had this great quote from Peggy Noonan in there talking about these cities. And I think independent of the process, I think that the one thing that I think that the president has done well, and Republicans that are supportive of his agenda, I think it's one of the things that resonates with people is his ability to come in and kind of just cut the process and take action. And this is an example where I think those, and David mentioned it very well. If Donald Trump announced that he had found a cure for cancer, there's a lot of people who would be out there saying, no, he didn't, or they would be critical of it. And that I think is sad. I think it's sad that our partisanship has gotten to the point that someone can't do anything without being criticized in some way. So I think David made a really good point. But my larger point is what I think a mistake that I think that Democrats are making, or people that are opposed to this move in DC, is they're out there trying to tell people how they feel, and then like their feelings are wrong. And I think that's a common problem. I think crime, what people perceive out there, might not be reflected in some of the data, but I think it's pretty fair to say that how people feel about DC related to the crime and what some politicians want to respond to that is in essence different. And the other point I would make is I think that there's a real connection between where Republicans, I think, have messaging opportunities is to talk about how some of these cities are run. And I think Bren made a great point in his commentary talking about how he thinks Minneapolis will be if the DSA takes over. And I think Republicans and the Trump administration, I think, is doing a good job of showing these cities and, as little laboratories of how Democrats and Democratic policies, the effects of them, the impacts of them, and him taking this step, and as David articulated at the beginning, Congress and the president does have a legal role in doing this. But I think it's interesting to see how this dynamic of this kind of law and order approach coming in and cleaning up these cities could potentially have a ripple effect, not in a bad way, but just have an impact in how the politics of a city and how it's run will become more nationalized and have it be a messaging opportunity for Republicans to show a leadership different in how they would run things. Buried in all of that kind of gobbledygook I just said was maybe a question or an observation that you guys want to respond to, but I wanted to offer it up.
Yeah, I think, you talked about kind of telling people they're wrong based on what they're seeing and experienced in real life. I think is, not generally advice I would give in politics. And I think some on the Democrat side have fallen into that. I think we saw it a lot in last cycle, in crime, definitely, in illegal immigration. Whatever you thought the solution was or wasn't, they were oftentimes dismissive of it even taking place when people could see it. It's not when there's camera and hundreds of people coming across a border crossing, and you have it on camera. People can see that, and so when you kind of try to dismiss it, it falls a little flat. I think, and it happened with inflation and cost of living. It's funny now we're very inflation obsessed since Trump has taken over, but most in the Democrat Party and their friends in the press, I know our very objective press here in Minnesota, never said the word inflation for 4 years, and it's transitory, and if you really look at it this way. And the DNC had to take down a tweet because they basically showed an inflation chart, but the entire chart showed the 4-year rise during the Biden administration of increased costs in things. It was only the last couple months that had the Trump administration, and it was basically flat during that time. So, I think, anytime you're trying to really tell people something that's the opposite of what they're experiencing, seeing, that's a tough road to go. And I do think there is pushback on some of the extreme that has happened in some of these cities. Yeah, I would encourage you or your listeners. One city that I think is kind of interesting is San Francisco, believe it or not. They had a lot of the big kind of DSA type push, the really, really far left. Now, granted, no one there still would, say they're a Republican and run for office. But more traditional, Democrats, kind of pushed them back and really retook some of their city on a lot of different levels on crime and other policies. So I think you have seen it in places where you've just seen some of this, the extremism go too far. And when you actually have that implemented in policy and have, negative real life consequences, then someone's got to come in and fix it.
I completely agree. And I think it's one of those, like you said, it's how people feel. And in these situations, it's perception is reality, right? Even if it has gotten better over the last year in DC and Minneapolis, St. Paul, that perception is there and that fear is there. So people now are just avoiding, and it's that ripple effect of that it's having in these cities. And we don't have the Democrat leaders in these areas standing up or at least not to my knowledge, on a widespread scale. And in DC, standing up with the forward-thinking plans or proposals of how to keep it going better. They're just trying to stand on, well, it's better. But that doesn't make it you feel any better or feel any safer. And I think this, to your point, Michael, is where Republicans could take advantage of it. I don't see a Republican, being elected mayor of Minneapolis or St. Paul anytime soon. But I mean, those of the messaging as a whole, I think it's something that, again, wanting to be a nation of laws, to uphold the laws as they are written and as they are meant to protect us and our neighbors. I think that's what Republicans are looking for. And that's what, again, let's talk about the suburban mom. That's what we want when we're raising our children, is to feel safe, to make sure we're raising our children in a place where they feel safe. And that if anybody does us harm or does anybody harm in our area, that they're going to have to face the consequences for doing so. I think crime is going to be an ongoing conversation that we're going to be having, especially the prosecution of crime, and how that is done or not done, because we just continue to see repeat offenders, getting away time after time, and then, doing ultimate horrific crimes when they could have been prevented. And certainly, people need to face the facts of what is being done when they don't prosecute that. So it's going to be interesting to watch how Trump and the administration handles this in Washington, D.C. Obviously, we're going to have no shortage of coverage of it. So I hope it is, pretty straightforward and not, getting into salaciousness on either side of the National Guard or the DC, the Trump, what am I saying? The power, the proposals, the plan that they're working on. I hope they don't go too far to make it something that it looks like they're taking advantage and trying to make a show. And I hope that, the protests and stuff don't get out of control to make it, what some TV fanfare, and we'll see how it plays out. But it will be interesting and something I was not anticipating on my bingo card for the week. All right. We are going to move on. And since we have David, who is who I attribute, and I don't think I'm alone in saying this, one of Minnesota's greatest political minds, right here at our disposal, we're going to just do a quick step into the general political landscape. We are heading not too far away from 2026 midterm elections. David, you've run a number of congressional campaigns. You've won statewide campaigns here in Minnesota. You were a state rep yourself. I want to get your take on all of the above, but starting with the 2026 midterms, which we know are not historically favorable towards the party in power or the presidential party. As your boots on the ground Republican, working for a Republican member of Congress in DC, what's the feel? What's the vibe? What do the polls say? What do you think?
Yeah, I think, first of all, no two elections are alike. And even when you try to say, well, this has got similar circumstances as that one, and so I'm going to make a lot of predictions of that, that's very hit or miss still. And this one in particular is a very, even in traditional senses, is not exactly the same as others that it might be equated to. It's a presidential midterm. It's a second term presidential midterm, which is a little more rare than just standard presidential midterm. And it's a second term non-consecutive of a presidential midterm, which we've only had one other in our entire history of our country. So and then let's be honest, it's Donald Trump, and it's a Donald Trump that's I think I believe a little different than he's been in the past. And I think there's just I think most people could see that. He just is more determined. I think he really knows that this is his legacy. He's got a unique position, to be able to make things happen. Let's not forget, he also experienced losing the U.S. House of Representatives, and after the 2018 election, really kind of lost a lot of the potential momentum for his first term. And so I think he's acutely aware that, for him to be able to continue to implement what he wants to get done in his second term, and really kind of have that capstone on his career. That's going to be a lot more doable if he can maintain, his party having control of Congress. So I think he's going to be incredibly invested in that outcome, and I think in general people are feeling pretty cautiously optimistic on the Republican side that that we can hold the House and the Senate. It's a generally favorable Senate map, for Republicans. So that I think helps equalize maybe what would normally be a little more of an uphill climb. So I think there's a lot of room for optimism. And quite frankly, I think a lot of what I see and there's numbers. I know the Star Tribune had the poll now a couple months ago, and in rough numbers, it was Republican approval of Republicans in Congress was at 88% approve, and Democrat approval of Democrats in Congress was around 60%. So I don't think they're really showing a total sense of unity or kind of cohesion of vision or who's the leadership and where are things at in their party. And so I think they have their own challenges on their side.
Completely agree. We've had lots of conversations too about the division within the Democrats that they, came out of the last election kind of questioning where they went wrong, where they really took, obviously didn't have their finger on the pulse of what American voters were wanting and feeling. And so I think that's something they're really trying to remedy. And excuse me, while 2 years is a long time, it's not that long of a time if you think it's, to completely overhaul kind of your strategy and messaging that they've really, been sinking into the last 5, 8, 10 years. So I think it will be, I'm very interested to see how they kind of angle things other than just not Trump, because obviously we know that that's not enough for them. Michael, what's your take on as we head in? We'll be doing more conversations as we go, but since we're here, I just need to get your take as somebody who is a little politically homeless on this.
I thought what David said, and again, this is a perfect example of why I love doing podcasts, because I get to sit back and listen to smart people talk, and listening to David speak and Becky obviously benefiting from all the shows we've done together. What I found really interesting, what David just said, was about how Democrats feel about Democrats and how Republicans feel about Republicans. I think that's really interesting right now. I would say, as someone, and I say this a lot, I try to get ahead of it before Becky brings it up. I was a Republican for Harris. I've not supported Trump in the past. I do think that this is a different Donald Trump. And I say that as an outsider. I say that as someone who hasn't supported him. I think he is governing in a different way. I think he's leading in a different way. I think he's collaborating in a different way. And I think that shows based on how Republicans are feeling right now about what's going on in Washington and the Democrats. I think Democrats are having a real identity crisis right now as to who they are and where they're at. And it's one thing to be critical of Republicans and the MAGA movement and Donald Trump. It's another to have an alternative. And I think nationally, I think Democrats are struggling. And I think David's point comes into how people are feeling about their elected members of Congress. And if Republicans can come into that election nationwide and having Republicans feel that good about how national Republicans are doing, my only concern is that they don't have that drive to get out into the polls and they keep that intensity, because sometimes I think people vote sometimes more what they're against and what they're for. And so I hope that Republicans can make the case. Republicans who are supportive will make the case, and Democrats need to do the job to make their case. But that intensity argument that David discussed, that point, very insightful point, and I hadn't seen that raised that way. And so it's a very interesting dynamic coming in.
Moving over to the Minnesota angle in all of this, we have a Senate seat up for grabs. Michael, you had a recent Substack of the Minnesota's political clock is ticking. David, from what you're hearing out there. We know that the Democrats have a great pool that they in this race already. We're hopeful that more Minnesota Republicans will jump in. The clock is quite literally ticking at that point, but is this a race that you expect would get some national exposure, or is that all hinging on who from our side would maybe throw their hat in the ring?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the candidate side of things will happen. Certainly the clock is ticking, but I still think there's a little time. I mean, there's people who, I mean, you just mentioned talking about the state. I mean, we could talk about the governor's race. I mean, we haven't, our sitting governor hasn't even announced if he's running or not. So I think that shows that there's certainly time for big dynamics of a race to change. The Senate is always interesting because it's typically the smallest number of highly targeted seats that we see in most things we look at. Obviously and compared to the U.S. House, I think even oftentimes with the national governors or attorney generals or things of that nature, and a lot of our state legislative races, the Senate, almost all the spending, it usually ends up going into about 7 races. And so you really just kind of end up on where's the chalk lines once you really start getting into the spending period. And if you've been able to prove that you can make this a race and put yourself in contention, and then just hope that races that Republicans have to defend look better than people might think, and there was nothing else that kind of popped up that you're competing with, because right now we're sort of right on that edge or potentially outside edge. And so you really kind of have to do the work to put yourself in that position. And then, quite frankly, then it's just some events above you. I mean, I think, politics, I always say, is there's the things you can control, and then there's just bigger dynamics in yourself that you can't. You're in a sailboat in the Pacific, so you just have to do all the things that you can right, and then hopefully the winds and the rains and the flows go the way that you need them to, and not against you. So,
Michael, I want you to chat a little bit more about your recent piece and where you stand on timing and hopefully some challengers getting in.
Yeah, I mean, the point of my post was to talk about timing, and I think sometimes at least there's an intensity gap that I think exists a little bit in campaigns, particularly in Minnesota at the statewide level. And I'm an intense person, and it's why I don't have a lot of caffeine. But I would just say I think that there is an intensity. I think there's, and I've been saying this for quite some time, particularly related to this cycle, Becky, which is, there were, 1.3 Democrats running for the United States Senate to replace Senator Tina Smith, who's not running. You had the lieutenant governor running, which she still is. You have Angie Craig, who is still running. And you had former state senator Melissa Lopez Franzen. All of them were running, and they're running aggressive campaigns, and they were raising money at a high amount. And I think that one of the things I would say to Republicans is you don't get to decide the speed and course of the race. It's determined by your opponent. And there are Democrats that are out there running for U.S. Senate for the open seat. Right now, there's no announced challengers for Attorney General, State Auditor, or Secretary of State. I think that Republicans need to fill those holes, because I know that there's a little bit of gamesmanship and people are waiting to see what Walz is going to do. I think Walz is going to run. I think he benefits. The longer he gets to announce, I think that benefits him. And it doesn't, the clock doesn't start. But I think he also doesn't have to announce right now, because I don't think he's getting the pressure that I think would exist in a normal political dynamic, when I think that the candidates understand the intensity. And so, I wrote that on my Substack. The point was to draw out some of the math related to fundraising, how difficult it is to raise money and how quickly you need to raise money. And the math is unforgiving. And so my message to Republicans who want to run, and as someone who wants to see a vibrant two-party system, clock's ticking and it's time to get in.
If I want to look at this with my rose-colored glasses and my glass half full, could it be possible that some of the top contenders, let's perhaps Speaker Dameth and Representative Robbins for two that I continually hear, is it possible they're having joint conversations behind the closed doors to maybe come out with a unified candidate versus getting 6 legislators all running for governor? Or am I just being Pollyannish with
I would hope that's the case. But the bottom line is whoever comes in, and I've mentioned this before, it's not necessarily about how many run, it's the quality of the campaign and the operation. And ultimately, one way in which to adjust that clock is if someone was self-funding. We're not seeing that on the Democrat or Republican side where someone is self-funding. And so my argument is, if you decide to run for governor, or if you decide to run for the United States Senate or those down ballot races, understand that the math is unforgiving. There's metrics you have to make every day in order to make the race competitive. And I think it's to some degree what David is saying about, the dynamics and thing above them. What will make the U.S. Senate race competitive in Minnesota is if there is a Democratic candidate campaign and a Republican campaign that are raising money at relatively the same pace. They're organizing and they're doing those things. So it's a bit of a horse race. The same will happen in the governor's race. The best way that I think Minnesota Republicans could make the governor's race competitive is to get in and have there be a campaign that's raising money at the level in which they can compete in the general election. That's my kind of message. And so we'll see what happens. But, to the degree which people want to listen to my advice and take it, that's the flag I've staked.
I like it.
Michael, I would say anytime I have talked to prospective candidates, I am pretty universal in do what you need to do to decide that you want to do this, that you think it's a viable path, that you're up for the challenge, that you want to do it, make a strategic plan for that timing and do it. Like I think there is a lot of natural procrastination that happens in this that I just think is generally not productive. I think once you want to do those things, you need to, like I said, I do hammer on people like you don't want to start and stop, right? You don't want to, but go through whatever you need to go through, get to that point where you've decided, make the plan with what makes the most sense, but do it expeditiously and get in the race. Because you said, math is unforgiving. I would say the calendar is unforgiving. The days will tick by, the weeks will tick by, the months will tick by, and no one can do anything about that.
You're absolutely right.
I mean, I think in you wrote it was some upwards of $20,000 a day from every day leading up until the election that these candidates are going to have to raise, and that's a heavy lift. So every passing day makes that number go a little bit higher.
Absolutely.
Do you want to jump into our next topic, which I think kind of coincides with what we'll be seeing heading into the 2026 election cycle, and that is messaging and polling and what the American people and specifically the Minnesota voters think. We saw this week America's First Policy Institute launched a Minnesota chapter, and with that put out a recent poll that was conducted by Torchlight Strategies and taken July 19th through the 24th. Some really, some surprising, some not surprising things in here, but I want to get into some of the specifics that we saw when we look into these numbers. Namely, do you think we're on the right track or wrong track? This is something that sometimes people love to hit on, sometimes people don't. I think it is a great one. If you remember, anybody listening, this was one Mark Drake hit on ahead of the 2024 election, and we kept coming back to it. But right now, 34% of Minnesotans believe we're on the right track, and 49% believe we are on the wrong track. David, in your experience over 15, 20 years here of doing this, how does that number stand in comparison to over the years, and is it, that's kind of high. Almost 50% of Americans believe that we're on the wrong track right now.
Yeah. In Minnesota, and again, every poll is going to be critiqued by everybody, but that's a very significant gap, and definitely one that I would say would be, it'd be concerning if I was looking at it from, from the Democrats' side, and from Walz in particular. I think there's, to any person around, the governor is the most responsible for their state being on the right track or wrong track. I don't think that's completely surprising given what we're seeing. And, quite frankly, just starting with, I've talked a lot for a lot of years about net state to state migration. I think it's one of, the great tools you have into looking at, in the marketplace of states, what are individual people choosing to do? Individual Americans deciding, I want to go here, I want to leave here. And, Minnesota in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s had a net state to state in-migration rate. We gained more people from other states than we lost to other states. That turned the corner in the around 2005, went the other way, but really accelerated in going the other way. I believe in the last 4 years, we've lost as much net state to state migration as we had in the previous 15 years. So it is rapidly accelerating. That's not a good sign. And there's actually some data that shows too, not only are the raw numbers bad, but we've actually it's accelerated in its the average worth and earnings of those individuals as well. And so we're net losing people who are net contributors to the state. And that's just, I think people see that. I think there's been enough of it. People have seen it in their own family and friend circles, that's a real thing. And I think that goes into people saying we're on the wrong track. And that's without even getting into, and I believe it's no small thing. I think a couple years ago, people saw it as, a more, partisan Republican thing. But the fraud, the rampant fraud in Minnesota, I think has got a lot of people's attention. I've heard it from a lot of people that I think are not political or not plugged in with all this. And they say, what is happening? How can this be taking place? And I really think it's something that the Walz administration and the Democrats in general of this state were incredibly slow to react to it. They seem to be making some initial first steps now, but I mean, you're talking years of this being out in the open, and now they're going to try to play, kind of tough cop on this. We'll see how effective that is, but I think that's a big piece as well.
So many great points there. And I think, to that fraud point, that was a question in here. Do you think it's widespread? Not widespread. 65% of Minnesotans do believe it's widespread. And I think with that, I think that's one thing that I personally believe that Republicans are messaging very well on, because they have the facts and the votes on their side. They're forcing some of these votes to be taken and forcing Democrats to basically say, no, thanks, we're not that interested in putting tools or putting steps in place to ensure this isn't prevented in the past. They're backwards looking. Let's figure out what went wrong and how it went wrong, but not, interested in passing those policies to make changes for the future. And I think that's something I've been impressed so far of Republicans at the legislature messaging on that. And I think it's a winning thing that we'll continue to see from them.
Well, and even in the reverse, Becky, I mean, I think it's astounding that there's, to my knowledge, maybe either of you know, but no person has lost their job in government for any part of this. Whose job is it to be watching this? You think of any company you run, it's someone's job. Someone approved something. Someone signed off on the check. Someone's job should have been, watching these things. Not a single person has been accountable for any of this. And again, they'll always, the pushback to it is, oh, well, we're prosecuting people. I'm not talking about that. That's great. That needs to happen. We need more of that. We need to make sure anybody who's doing that. But there's a reason that this has been pervasive, widespread, and long term. And that's because it continues to not, the accountability side has not been there on the government who's operating this money, who's expending this money. That's our taxpayer money. And I think that's a real problem. And I haven't seen the administration or Democrats even remotely acknowledge that.
One of the points that I would say on that, and Becky, we had two things I want to chime in on. Number one, I was having conversations yesterday with some Democrats about that exact issue. I think waste, fraud, and abuse, and I think as David's articulated, is going to be one of the key issues in the upcoming election cycle. And specifically what David said, which is that we've had this level of waste, fraud, and abuse, criminal fraud, where we've had all these people prosecuted, but I'm not aware of any government official who's been terminated, had their role reduced, or suffered any type of disciplinary action, absent losing their job, related to that system. And, Becky, and I think that's going to be a substantive statewide issue. And I think that, when you have the acting U.S. attorney going out there and saying that Minnesota has a fraud problem, why is that the case? And I don't think we've adequately gotten an answer as to why that is the case, nor have we seen the type of reaction. And I also think it's an issue that potentially can divide Democrats. Becky, we had Senator Heather Gustafson on talking about her initiative that had bipartisan support for an office of Inspector General in the state. I've said we had Representative Kristen Robbins on the show, and we talked about that. And I said then, and I stand by my position, which is that kind of independent auditor would be a great thing. But that's a future that helps what happens going forward. It doesn't address what happened in the past. And I think one of the things that I think Democrats need to be mindful of in the next election is that when you occupy office and you have these roles, when this is happening, you have to accept some of the responsibility of what happens. And I think it's going to be a marquee issue and very fertile ground for Republicans come next year.
Absolutely. I do want to keep going on this poll because I think we could probably talk for hours upon hours about fraud and the issues surrounding that, and I'd be happy to do that in a future show. One of the questions was, do you believe Minnesota's economy is getting better or worse? 13% say better, 54% say worse, with about 27% say staying the same. And coupled that with, do you agree or disagree that lowering taxes would make life better in Minnesota? Nearly 70% say they agree, and 25% say they disagree. And I think, David, this goes straight to your point of those folks leaving the state. We're seeing business owners leaving the state because it is not worthwhile to advantageous to do business here, where the red tape and regulations obviously are enough, but the cost of doing business, the taxes. And then, I went to college in Wisconsin. My in-laws live in Wisconsin. I know a lot of people hop, skip, and jump over that border because taxes in Wisconsin can look a lot more flexible or a lot more adaptable for especially growing families. I think of myself and the cost of that is added every single year that we just keep seeing not coming into our home, not coming into being able to provide for our children and their future. And so it does not surprise me about those. And those are things that I think really are going to be a flashpoint for Democrats. What do you think? What's your take with that, David?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I would look at like we just had to do. I know it got a lot of overshadowed with the one big beautiful bill and everything surrounding that. But that one of the major components of the one big beautiful bill was extending, in a lot of cases, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions from 2017. And so really, the massive motivation behind everything that went behind the passage of that reconciliation package was that we would have seen the largest tax increase in American history at the end of this year on many Americans had those provisions expired. I am not aware of at any time any person that came to lobby us in any way to say, let those expire. I want my taxes to increase. So Look, in a general thing, I think most people certainly want to, keep the money that they earn, right? But I do think this ties a lot into, the previous discussion on fraud, because I think to the extent that people will say, I don't like doing this, but I understand it. It's being managed well. It's going to the, right places. It's helping schools. It's helping the needy. I mean, when we're buying Ferraris and yachts and beach homes for people who are defrauding our state, oftentimes for extended months and years, that's a massive frustration. So then you take the bottom line of that, and then just the psychological impact that says that not only am I paying a high tax rate, but it's being absolutely squandered and thrown away. And let's not forget, a lot of people still talk about the $18 billion dollar surplus, and a lot of what I hear is people say, "Where did it go?" It just seemed like it vanished and was gone. And I certainly, I know Democrats have their messaging on what happened to that, but there's a lot of people I hear from that seem to have no clue where it went.
Well, especially when not only do we not know where it went, but we're still being paid more because they blew it and raised taxes another $2 billion. I mean, it's just absolutely insane.
Well, and structurally put us on a trajectory of having bigger deficits that we now are going to raise more taxes. I mean, Minnesota's at risk of being the highest tax state in the nation.
When we do look at the top 4 issues affecting the state of Minnesota, according to respondents, 22%, with the 22%, the highest top issue is the prices, cost of living, economy for Minnesotans who participated in this. Number 2 is taxes, coming in at 12%, illegal immigration at 9%, and crime at just under 8%. So those are the top 4, with almost 34% of that being the taxes, cost of living, and the money that is coming out of Minnesota pockets, whether that is to the government, to our cost of eggs, to childcare, whatever it may be. So that's something I think that we're going to expect to see more and more of, conversations from both sides heading into 2026. 2 things that I do want to hit on outside of those issues, but I think are interesting numbers for me. One, when we look at the abortion issue, pro-life, they asked if they consider themselves pro-life or pro-choice. 36.5% considered themselves pro-life, with just under 60% considering themselves pro-choice. This is something Michael and I have talked a lot about on the podcast, something I think that as generations change and our generations get older and other older generations, there's no easy way to say that, age out or die off, or however you want to say it. I do see this number continuing to shift, I feel like.
As someone who's aging out of things all the time, I'm very sensitive to how you phrase that.
Yeah, so am I, but
but this is something with those numbers, David, I know you've been in the reddest of red districts all the way to more purpley districts that you've worked within. Do you think that seeing numbers like this, if we continue to see this across more polls, will that maybe deter, or do you think Republicans will stop both delegates, activists, voters, and candidates? Do you think there's any stop talking about the abortion issue, or do you think it's always going to be, or at least for the foreseeable future, be something that we expect to be something voters discuss and want to know about their candidates?
I would imagine that it's going to continue to be a topic that's going to be discussed. I don't think it's going to disappear in any way. I think a lot of the thing is how it's going to be discussed, and how what are the actual policy discussions surrounding that. I think I've actually seen some polling that bifurcates a lot of those issues a lot more. So it's not just kind of distilling it or simplifying it down to, are you pro-life or are you pro-choice? It gets into kind of some of the actual policy details. And that's where you really see some different stories, and really, I think a lot of the growth that you've seen is a lot of people are, and I know this is a difficult thing for many people to talk about, but I think a lot of people are a lot more nuanced on it than probably either side that is more comfortable with with kind of the one side or the other distinction would like to say. Again, the numbers really do. If you look into things that are more show the gradation of that, there is a lot of in between.
One question on this that I want from both of you that takes us a little bit away from this and plops us back at the state convention, in this upcoming May. Do you think either for governor or Senate on the Republican side, this cycle or in 4 years, we will be able to have a Republican for statewide office have a asterisk next to that? Maybe not saying I'm 100% pro-choice, but do you think that delegates in particular are going to be open at all, amenable at all to hearing the buts, that what ifs, the exceptions to abortion, and would they endorse a candidate that has those?
David?
I mean, I would start off with for one thing, every delegate pool, resets to some degree. And so you're never dealing with exactly the same pool. And it's always going to be changing. I don't know. I mean, someone would have to be able to explain that in a way that was, that people accepted. I mean, I think there's a lot of things that Donald Trump has done that a lot of people said Republicans would never, support that or be okay with that. And they are. And quite frankly, on the contrary, there's a lot of things that Democrats have seemingly in a race to be anti-Trump have become. I mean, when I have seen like major trade unions essentially coming out for, old school Republican style free trade agreements because they're against tariffs. It's
Right.
It's a topsy turvy world sometimes. So it's hard to ever know for sure.
Absolutely.
What I would say is this. I think David answered that very well over the course of the questions. Number one, with nuance. I think when you break it down, this is an issue that I think if you have to put people into a box, I do believe that where the state of Minnesota is in terms of what we allow in terms of abortion, I think the vast majority of Minnesotans would like to see that in some way defined differently. The challenge is, how do you get that done? And so I think David is right when you talk about the nuance and the detail. And the reality is, I'm not trying to make light of it, but the devil is in the details when it comes to that. And I think if you were to look at that issue, I think that where the state, what is permissible in this state today, if that was up for a debate where the will of Minnesota would decide, I think they would probably dial it back a bit, and we wouldn't have the level of access to such degree terms so late into the pregnancy on abortion that we currently have. Now, do I ever think that the activists inside the party are going to ignore that issue? No, I don't. But the question is, how much significance do they put on it? Do they accept the reality of where the state is and where we need to go? I think that's the broader question, and I don't know that. I think it's yet to be determined. I don't see at any point that the Republican Party nationally or in Minnesota fully divest themselves of any abortion, any pro-life language that they have. The question is, how much of an emphasis on it? In my history that I've been alive and what I've seen, Republicans have only endorsed one candidate that was pro-choice for statewide office, and that was Judy Dutcher in 1998. And Republicans didn't know that she was pro-choice. They didn't ask her. So that's the only reason it's really happened. And so it would take a big shift. I think the best case scenario, to the degree at which people view the politics of abortion as not being helpful to Republicans, I think the best you're going to get is people to not have it be a front and center issue, but I don't think it's going to go away forever.
Well said. I think that Democrats are going to do their best to try to make it a front and center issue as long as they have the power to do so. So I hope that our candidates, whoever jump in the ring, have those answers tied up in a nice little bow, because it's going to get asked. It's going to have to be answered, and can certainly get them in trouble, as we've learned from recent years. Last thing I want to hit on here is a question, another one that was a little surprising to me, was, do you support or oppose legislation that requires employers to pay for government mandated paid sick time off? 61.2% support, 30% oppose, so almost 2/3 are on the support side. Michael, does this surprise you? What is your take on that?
Here's what I would say generally about that question and the other questions. I mean, obviously, they support it. I think that what this poll shows is that what are the top issues are issues that Republicans are going to do well on if they message on them. They can talk about the support for sick time, but the other issues, I think this is the potential for this election, if it's on waste, fraud, and abuse, how government is run, tax structure, where the state is going. And I think probably the most fascinating point that David's brought up is the fact that we have people leaving the state. One of the things that I've always grown up with is that Minnesota exceptionalism, that belief that Minnesota, we're better than our friends in Wisconsin, certainly in football, and our friends in Iowa and North Dakota. But the reality is that we've seen people leaving this state, and that has to be, we need to have that discussion. If we have a conversation next election cycle and come in the election cycle about waste, fraud, and abuse, taxes and spending, the state budget, where it's going, some of that the structural balance, where the state's going long term, and the fact that people are leaving this state, that is an election cycle that I think gives Republicans a lot of safe harbor to talk about policy in a way that is very beneficial to them, that I think would make that a very fascinating election cycle and very substantive. Do I think it could just be all about abortion? Well, if the Democrats have their way, yeah. I mean, that's really what it could be about. But I think that question and some of the things that David said really frames it up in a good way.
Well, I think as we get closer to the 2026 cycle, David, we're going to want you back to analyze what our candidates are actually saying and how we think it is voting well or not for them. So thank you for all of that. But now I'm going to take you into the deep seeds of Minneapolis politics and all the antics there for last few minutes here, because I know we're running up against time. But an interesting article this week came out following a report by the Minneapolis City Auditor. They came out with a report that said that 3 city council aides participated in the protests earlier this summer on the June 3rd federal drug raid. Minneapolis police, there was a raid at a Lake Street Mexican restaurant, and 3 employees who work for the legislative department participated. 2 were aides to the council vice president. One was also aide to another council member, Jeremiah Ellison. And after this, some questions come up about how we look at First Amendment rights as well as being city employees. Basically, the auditor's office opted not to pursue a legal assessment, but recommended that the city council basically figure it out, develop expectations around speech, peaceful assembly, timekeeping. To be fair, these ones, it is found that these individuals did take 8 hours off that day. They were not on the city time, which is a great one, but they were right there on the front lines. Auditor's report said the employees either made physical contact with federal law enforcement officers or were extremely close in proximity to them. And again, it's that the report said it damaged organizational trust and raised questions about expectations. David, I worked for you for a handful of years over the years. A couple of things that I feel like were the mantra of that is don't be the story. And you are always representing your member, your office, your role. To set it out there, these council members did do back what their employees are saying, so that's great. I would think that they probably would in a private setting and maybe reprimand them a little bit in private. But what's your take on this as political appointees to their city council members that they are working for?
Yeah, definitely. You know, what you said, I mean, you can, and obviously if it's government paid situation, you should be taking, your time off from your day job to be doing what you're doing, but you still are representing what you're a part of. If you're working, for someone or working for an entity, so there's only so much you can really separate that, and I always just say you can't. I mean, I know, like, I saw something with Omar who's the endorsed Democrat candidate challenging Jacob Fry. Said his number one priority was going to be to stop Trump from, apprehending illegal immigrants. I mean, I obviously admit I know that Minneapolis has a very different electorate than I'm that familiar with. If I'm a standard Minneapolis resident, I would not necessarily want that to be my mayor's number one objective. To me, it's a bit of a strange reaction. I think the way that they've come at this. Again, I think this goes back to the Democrats really not acknowledging the border crisis that happened under the Biden administration, and kind of now not acknowledging some of the realities that are out there of what they're dealing with. I mean, obviously some of the illegal immigrants that have been apprehended are really and deported, some very, very dangerous criminals, and a lot of them are really just not being productive members of society, that's for sure, and have broken rules along the way. So, I don't know, like, the political angle of fighting law enforcement to protect people who are breaking the law.
We had there was a quote in the story I read from Councilmember Linnea Palmisano, who we had on the podcast last year. She said she supports the employees' right to free speech and protest, but questioned their presence during the day and whether that attempted to obstruct the execution of criminal search warrants. She said, were they seen as representing the city? Did they disrupt MBD's operation? And did they damage community trust? These are important questions. And I think it's something that, like I said, this report really laid out that they were not citing any specific legal issues with this, but basically say, you guys got to figure your S out, because this, you got to have it written down somewhere that this is allowed, what is allowed, when it's allowed, what a person needs to do. Because I feel like, protests are kind of the norm, and the old school thought that was back in my day of staffers don't get to have opinions, don't get to participate in that. You work for your boss, you promote your boss, which I still firmly believe is the role of anybody working in these offices. Your job is to uplift and maintain your boss's policy position statements and not go beyond that. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of this. Michael, thoughts?
First of all, let me say I would have appreciated David's wisdom that he laid out for you at a few points in my career. That could have maybe kept me on the straight and narrow a few times, number one. Number two, let me just say this. Becky, when you were on maternity leave, I had a discussion with Brian Strasser about some of the misinformation that came out of that protest. And to see some staffers that were participating in nefarious ways, or in problematic ways, I would say. I'm a big advocate of the First Amendment. I would consider myself to be probably outside of the mainstream of Republicans on that particular issue, because I am such a strong advocate of the First Amendment. That being said, there's legitimate questions about what they were doing there, independent of their work. It does reflect poorly when there is the potential for staffers, for city council members out there, engaging in disruption, not acting appropriately with law enforcement. There was a lot of misinformation out there. The other point I would say is about this kind of activism that we're seeing in Minneapolis. I think ties very well with Senator Fattah, who's the been endorsed by the Democratic Socialists, and right now is the endorsed candidate by the Minneapolis DFL for that seat. He has continued to spread misinformation about what was going on that day. And so when you have electeds out there spreading information, including someone who wants to be mayor, coupled with city council members and then staffers doing things, you're really creating a climate where the city, not just the leadership, but the staff is going to be hostile with law enforcement and not build trust with the community. By the way, I also want to say, as a Republican, I was taught at a very early age that Republicans don't participate in protests. And there's only been one that I participated in. That was when I worked for the state party. We did a protest at the Star Tribune headquarters about polling. That's the only protest I've ever been at. And I rally for things. I don't participate in protests. So I'm not your protest expert.
There's definitely a segment of the Democrat Party that is very big believers in protesting. I mean, we have seen it over the years. They continue to do it now. So I know that's maybe a bigger part of their base electorate. But I think a lot of times it's counterproductive. I mean, they did it at two events in Rochester yesterday that Congressman Finstad was at, and in one he's meeting with county commissioners, and in a meeting that everybody then could see and hear the discussion and the answers and everything else, and literally within 5 minutes they were not able to even come to order enough without having it to the commissioners themselves say that they were going to end it. So I don't think a lot of times it really is a productive way to have the policy discourse that we hopefully should have in this country.
Becky, before we end this segment and before your former boss leaves, do you want to disclose any protests that you participated in for the record here? You've gone to or participated in anything that would be classified as a protest? Or David, if you wanted to divulge anything from Becky's employment record about her engaging in protests that you became aware of, I think it would be a great way to end this segment and our time with David.
Should be telling me for the first time. So
No, I have not participated in any, but if you may remember, I was able to kick a protester out of a Romney event in 2012 when she spat on somebody else. Some 70-plus-year-old woman. It was very exciting. So that's my claim to fame, but I have not had the privilege of protesting.
And that's a great opportunity for me to republish that clip, which I'll do. It was a fantastic clip. You did a great job. David, I'll let Becky do the final exit, but I can't thank you enough for being here. And this time acknowledging that I'm on the show too was really nice. Made me feel good.
Yes. Thank you so much, David. Michael. Always love hearing your expertise and everything DC and politics related. We certainly want to have you back as we head towards the 2026 election, because while you were pro and chief of staff on the Hill, I personally love all of your takes on everything campaigning and on the political side as well. So we'll be sure to get you back sooner than later.
Always great to be on, Becky. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, David.
Bye.
Becky, we just recorded an interview with David FitzSimmons, one of our favorite guests. I want to just take just a few minutes, get your take on the interview.
I feel like I could forget to ask questions because it's just so entranced by David and his everything that he can pull into these conversations. I think he's brilliant. Enough said. I could sing his praises all day, every day. And I'm so glad that he is still one of the good guys fighting the good fight in Washington, D.C. He works so tirelessly on behalf of the constituents, but also within the Republican Party and staying active, often chairing the state or CD conventions, really lending his Robert's rules and his MNGO Constitution and bylaws and all of his expertise of the inner workings of the state party I know a lot of candidates go to him when they're considering running or already in running. And, he never wants to shy away from helping anybody or anyone who wants to make life a little bit better for Minnesotans, and whether that's as a candidate or as an elected official. And so grateful we have him on our team. So grateful to have him as a friend, and was lovely to have him back on the podcast.
I think it's a couple of things I want to say. I've been listening to some of our previous episodes, and one of the things I think that is pretty unique that we've done is we always take these couple minutes after these interviews to talk about these people when they're not there. And it really, I think we're sincere in the interviews, certainly with them, but it really shows that the people we try to bring on are people that we really want to hear from, that we want to learn from, and people that we want to promote. David is one of those people. I mean, as I sat there and listened, he just rattled off. I mean, the way his brain works, his mind works, I think is just so impressive. And he rattled out just a number of statistics and a number of data points that could work in at the Humphrey Institute, and they could work at the local bar, or at the local grocery store. I mean, people would understand what he was saying. And I think that's the wisdom of David. That's the experience of David, and that's why I think he's such an asset to have on. And every time we have him on, I learn more from speaking with him. But it really does, as you said, cements in my mind why David is such the go-to Republican in this state, not just this state and nationally. And it really makes me feel good about where Republicans can go, knowing that David FitzSimmons is continually looked upon as a voice of wisdom, a voice of logic, a voice of strategic direction. And I think he is someone who absolutely bleeds the Republican Party. I mean that in a good way. I mean, red, white, and blue, and whatever we're talking about. But he's what I think of as just an absolutely someone who understands the reality of campaigns, but also where people are in the state. I think his answers were fantastic, and I'm so appreciative that you have that friendship with him, much better than I do, that you're able to get him on and to come on, and I'm just a great beneficiary of listening to those conversations. So thank you, and once again, thank you to David.
FitzSimmons for president.
That's right, FitzSimmons for president. Before we go, I want to remind our listeners, unless you have anything else to
Nothing else here.
apologize for, disclose, no protests.
No,
I don't think you would do well at a protest.
I don't think
Meaning
so
it as
either.
I think that you are too much of a rule follower, and I think you would be like, oh, I don't know. I mean, even though you're someone, as the legal analyst for the podcast, you are someone who knows the full breadth and boundaries of the First Amendment, and you would fully exercise your right in being at a protest. But I just don't think it would be comfortable for you.
I have way too much of a rule follower, way too much anxiety about, even if we could be somewhere legally, no.
Yeah, all right. So that's good. So I want to remind our listeners that the third season of the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky Pick'em League is going to be starting soon. I, according to betting pools that I've seen, am the heavy favorite to win this year. I want to make sure our listeners know that there will be a trophy unveiling relatively soon before the season kicks off. It's been going through multiple drafts, multiple revisions to really show, and I hope people participate and join. And Becky, I think, if I understand correctly, you've committed to come back.
Absolutely.
And is your husband coming back?
Oh, I'll make them.
That sounds good. Yes. Yeah. And I hope my wife come back and we'll open it to the public, and I'll be sharing some of those links on social media so people can participate. I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before you go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or the platform where you listen. You can also follow us on our website and across all social media platforms at BB Breakpod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Bye-bye.